So honey, now take me into your loving arms.
Welcome to the New York Times Podcast. You're truly, these lines are blurred, of music, news, and criticism. I'm your host, John Caramonica. That is extraordinarily famous pop star Ed Sheeran. It's Thinking Out Loud. Or if you are feeling litigious, it is an unauthorized remake of Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. Ed Sheeran recently won a copyright case against the estates of one of the songwriters of Let's Get It On. Ben Sisario is here, and he's going to immediately correct me, I'm sure, if I don't have this right. But it had been reported that Ed Sheeran's song was too close of a ripoff. If you've been listening to podcasts long enough, you'll understand that pop music is, in large part, merely a daisy chain of ripoffs over eras and generations and cross genres and so on and so forth. But Sheeran has been on the front lines of this for a little while. He is sued. I would assume he's sued way more often than we actually see in court, because his songs are, number one, very popular and therefore very profitable. And number two, like many pop songs, work off of some basic pop music building blocks that have been in use for decades. And so if you are feeling litigious and you or someone that you represent use those same building blocks 10, 20, 30, 40 years prior, you might want to take a crack at Ed Sheeran, because maybe that's going to be your biggest payday. Ben Sisario is here to explain, hopefully better, all the things that I just talked about. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
Ben, also, before we start, something that I have to do is I have to send you some Popcast stickers. I know you have the shirt, but I have to send you some stickers as well.
Okay, sure. Send them.
I'm going to send them. If you are so inclined to have some Popcast stickers, it's thepopcast.myshopify.com. There are also a few t-shirts left, but mostly it's stickers, and there'll eventually be other things too. But I got a whole bunch of stickers last week. I started mailing them out a few days ago. I'm excited. I hope some people are going to put them up in like bar bathrooms or whatever. So that would be great. It's thepopcast.myshopify.com. I will say that the Popcast logo on the stickers and the t-shirts is a reference. It's a reference to Cameron's Purple Haze, but I'm going to argue that it's fair use. That's where I'm standing. Ben,
did you just trick me into doing branded content? Is that what just happened?
My entire life is branded content. When you are a brand, your whole life is branded content. I just want to say, Ben, I know that Ed Sheeran won. Can you first explain, before we get to this, based on what you saw at the trial, and you were there, based on what you saw at the trial, were you expecting a Sheeran victory, or were you surprised that it tilted that way?
Well, one of the things about these copyright lawsuits is they're very unpredictable when they go before the jury. My perception, just being there and, using my eyes and ears, the defense had a very strong case defending Ed Sheeran. The plaintiffs seemed to have a pretty weak case. And so just by handicapping the cases that the two sides presented, it seemed to overwhelmingly favor Ed Sheeran. I really wasn't sure. We might get into this, but there was the possibility that the verdict could be a complex, nuanced kind of a thing. As it happened, he just won straight up. His song was independently created, therefore there was no copying. But the questions that were put to the jury, there were, I think, 7 of them, and it was rather complex about, exactly what he was accused of and what parts of the two songs are protected by copyright and which parts are not protected. So there was at least the possibility that there could have been some complicated result, that maybe they could have dinged him for something, but not the whole shebang. He seemed to have a much stronger case, but you never know what the jurors are going to think.
The thing that I was wondering about, and I feel like there were allusions to this throughout the coverage of the trial, as far as how Sheeran, when he was on the stand, was responding to questions or addressing some of the key points that were at issue. Is Ed Sheeran's being charming or being affable, amiable on the stand, is that something that, do you think, helped him? Would a more caustic pop star in the same scenario, making the same arguments, do less well in front of a jury?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a performance. I think his charm and his personality really did help him. You're probably alluding there to Robin Thicke in the Blurred Lines trial. You know, he really did not put on a very good face. He came across as arrogant. He talked about being high on drugs all the time while they were making the song. I don't know what was in the jurors' minds, but I think their impression of him and Pharrell was that these were arrogant, rich guys who were annoyed that they had to attend this trial at all.
Probably that is accurate, if we're being honest. That is probably accurate. And it's probably also accurate of Ed Sheeran, if we're keeping it a buck.
He kind of went up to a certain line. I think his personality is very endearing. And when he told his story, his lawyers had a good strategy about how to present him. They talked about his beginnings in music and how at age 17, he quit school, went to London, lived in some apartment above a bar and like did every open mic night in town and like was just really hungry and wanted to like collaborate with everybody he could. And that came across as very positive. And then he played guitar and he sang. You know, it was a pretty magical thing to witness that, to see, first of all, a super famous musician on the stand in a federal courthouse, pick up his guitar, play it, being asked something like, you know, what are the chords that you did play, Ed? And he plays some and he sings along. And then there was a segment where they were talking about all the mashups that he does. There was even like argument about like, do we call it a mashup? Do we call it a medley? What do we call this? But, you know, he would demonstrate like how he goes from playing a little bit of his song to somebody else's song to another song back to his. And there was a whole series of demonstrations, both on video and live, of him showing, you know, what he does and how he does it. And I think that was a pretty dazzling thing to witness.
This is a good moment to listen to a little bit of Let's Get It On, a fair use amount, lest anybody feel catchy.
I've been really trying, baby, trying to hold back this feeling for so long. And if you feel like I feel, baby, then come on. Oh, come on. Woo. Let's get it on.
Now, I think it's safe to say there are similarities between these songs, but obviously they are not identical. It is fair to say that there are similarities. How did Ed on the stand both acknowledge the similarities while also saying, I did not rip off this song?
Well, first of all, you know, he talks very openly about his influences, and he talked a lot about Van Morrison. And it came out during the trial and in some of the exhibits. There's like an email chain with his manager, where after they wrote it, they call it the Van Morrison song, because to him, it was reminiscent of Van Morrison, especially Crazy Love has in one part a very similar cadence to it. He said he knew the song Let's Get It On, but didn't really know it, never played it. He'd never used it for one of his mashups until after he released Thinking Out Loud. And, you know, his entire side like never disputed the fact that the 4-chord progression that's at the heart of Thinking Out Loud is very similar to the 4-chord progression in Let's Get It On. 3 of the chords are identical. One of them is different. It's similar in its sort of function in the song, but it's pretty indisputable, I would say, even though there was dispute about it, that the 2nd chord that he plays is different from the 2nd chord in the Marvin Gaye song. And, you know, he showed that on the stand. The plaintiffs had a musicologist expert, their expert witness. He did his analysis of the song, and he insisted that at the beginning of Thinking Out Loud, that the version of the chord that Ed is playing there is the same as the one in Let's Get It On. And Ed really reacted to that. He picked up his guitar. He showed it. He was like, I don't do it that way. I do it this way.
Can I ask a real ding-dongy question? A chord is a chord. How can there be a version of it if Ed is indeed doing it the other way? How is a musicologist reading it and saying it's the first way? What's happening there?
Well, first of all, there's many ways to voice a chord of the different notes that can be written on a staff. And the simplest, most basic way is a triad of 3 notes. But at various points in the song, Ed is not playing the triad. He's playing something else. And a couple times it's just the first and the third notes, and he's leaving out the second one. And that second note is the part that indicates whether it's major or minor. The difference between Marvin Gaye's chord and Ed Sheeran's chord is only 1 note. They share 2 notes in common. And that third note is the thing that determines that whether they are different versions of the same chord or whether Ed's chord is a totally different chord. If he was playing, I guess it's a C sharp. If he was playing a C sharp, it would be minor, but he's actually playing the D. And so it's a D major. And there was probably, John, like 3 hours of testimony on that point. I feel like I'm pretty steeped in this and I'm basically musically literate, and like it's a bit much to take. And I can't imagine what the jurors were thinking as they sat through that.
On some level, and I'm not making a case about the strength of Sheeran's argument or the other argument, but Ed Sheeran just needs the jury to believe him. Even if he's lying, he just needs the jury to believe, like when the musicologist says it's A and he says it's B, he just needs them to believe it's B. That's it.
Pretty much. And there's also like dueling musicologists. Like in these kinds of cases, what happens is...
Damn, imagine the conferences. When they show up at next year's International Musicology Symposium, it's about to be warfare.
I mean, that was in one way, like one of the most amusing parts of this is that the 2 experts, they're both music professors, were just absolutely vicious to each other and seemed to take every opportunity to insult each other and to say that the other guy's analysis is absurd and preposterous. And what are some of the other adjectives? I don't even remember. I wrote them in one of my stories. Basically, there's a handful of witnesses. Marvin Gaye is no longer with us. And Ed Townsend, who was his collaborator, who was like the primary songwriter of the song, he's dead. In fact, there were 3 family members who sued. It was his daughter, Catherine, and then a sister and his former wife. The wife was dead at the time they filed the suit, and so it was her estate. But the sister was alive, and she gave a deposition. But in the 6 or 7 years that it's taken for this to go to trial, the sister died. So there was only one surviving plaintiff to go to trial, and it was this woman, Catherine Griffin Townsend. She wasn't the songwriter. She wasn't the performer. So Ed and his co-writer, Amy Wadge, they were the only people that were actually involved in the making of one of the songs. And that is very strong testimony. So, he plays the guitar, he explains how he wrote it, but under cross-examination, he got very testy. On one level, he's passionate and like he's being accused of stealing something. And so he's upset about it. It came across that he was angry and he interrupted the questions a lot. I remember that the lawyer for the plaintiffs was starting to question him about this, which chord are you playing stuff. And he interrupted him and was like, do you believe that? Come on, man. Like, is that your theory of this? I felt that was a risk for Ed Sheeran. His expert had a very strong testimony. I think that on the law, his lawyers also had a strong argument to make. Ed on the stand risked it a little bit by being so combative that took a little bit of the sheen off it, I think. But ultimately, obviously it didn't cost him anything.
So amiable, but up to a point.
Yes.
And I imagine, as you said, these are performances when people testify. These are performances as well. And it does seem like a fine line to me to be condescending to the people who are cross-examining you while trying to bring the jury with you in that condescension. Not simply coming off like an entitled famous person. That's different. There are plenty of entitled famous people who are condescending, and then you watching that condescension think, that person would be condescending to me as well. It's another thing altogether to be condescending and have a jury be like, he's appropriately condescending. That is correct. As a strategy, that seems uncertain to me. Tell me, from witnessing it, what was it like seeing him pull that off?
I didn't see any reaction on the faces of the jury. I actually thought they were pretty poker faced through most of the whole trial, but it kind of ratcheted up the tension in the room a little bit. I knew that the legalese stuff would be a little hard to grasp, and the dense musicology of is he playing an A suspended second there or not is also going to be a little hard to grasp. Like a lot of trials, it does come down to the personalities. It does come down to like, do I like this guy? Do I trust this guy? Who do I just feel in my gut is more right here? And so that was one moment that I felt that was a little bit of a risky step for Ed to take.
This is a great moment, speaking about amiability, to take a quick break and listen to a person who maybe is not considered as amiable as we mentioned before. Let's listen to Blurred Lines. This is thick with Pharrell and T.I., who was removed from the case. We'll take a quick break, and I hope everybody will consider the politics of kindness.
If you can't hear what I'm trying to say, if you can't read from the same page, maybe I'm going deaf, maybe I'm going blind, maybe I'm out of my mind. Okay, now he was close, tried to domesticate you, but you're an animal, baby, it's in your nature, just let me liberate.
Okay, we're back. Ben Cesario's here. What did that song make you feel? Jason Green at Pitchfork wrote a really, really good piece a few weeks ago about the long shadow cast by Blurred Lines, legally, emotionally, grossly, the many layers upon which this song works on your soul and your spirit. But it was also another case of potentially ripping off a Marvin Gaye song. Not the same songwriter, but this case was a much different outcome. Do you want to explain the differences between the Blurred Lines case and the Thinking Out Loud case?
Well, on one level, they were exactly the same kind of a case. I mean, it was, you ripped off my song. And that's what most of these kinds of cases are. It had to do with the songwriting specifically, not the sounds on the recording. That was a critical thing to the Ed Sheeran trial. But the other thing is that one of the sort of trends in all of this music copyright litigation over the last bunch of years is that, like, historically, if somebody was accused of copying another song, they were basically talking about the main melody. The accusation would usually be, that song stole my melody, the most recognizable thing, the thing that the lead singer sings. Sometimes it's the hook, sometimes it's an entire line in the verse. If you think about, like, one of the other most famous cases is George Harrison, My Sweet Lord. He was accused of copying that vocal melody from the Chiffons' He's So Fine, and he lost. It was found that he had copied it subconsciously, which is now a big part of all of these cases. And in fact, Ed was questioned about that. But the trend more recently has involved less the sort of central vocal melody of the songs than the grooves and, like, shorter passages within them. And so in Blurred Lines, it was the background vibe of the groove and even the atmosphere. The plaintiffs would argue with me about that. They would say it's specific things in the music, but that case was very controversial because they couldn't really point to any long passages of music that were copied. Instead, it was what their expert called constellations of similarities, which were like a little bit here, structural points about it. The result seemed to be that Robin Thicke and Pharrell copied a groove. They copied a vibe. And it's the kind of thing that usually happens all the time and is fair game. This Ed Sheeran case was also about basically the groove. It's the 4 chords that repeat. And since this is songwriting, it's really just sort of the chords themselves as you can write them down on a piece of paper.
It's important to underscore what's actually on trial here. It is the written score. of song 1 versus song 2.
Basically, in the case of Let's Get It On, it was literally the written sheet music when they registered the original song for a copyright. And in Ed Sheeran's case, it's still the recording, but it's like the recording is considered the embodiment of a composition. And so what can you write down on a piece of paper from what that recording is? So the sound of Ed's voice doesn't matter. The sound of the drums doesn't matter, but it's what chord is he playing? What notes is he singing? If you were to recreate his song in a new way. It's a little bit of a misnomer to say sheet music, but it's like the songwriting is a separate copyright from the recording. And so the songwriting piece was what was on trial.
We're dealing with a very particular style of music and certainly era of music with the Marvin Gaye record. What is the likelihood of a similar kind of thing being applied to like a Yeat record or, you know, a Young Thug record, like songs where there's not notation, or at least not in the classic sense. Like it didn't start with notation and get built upon that. How is this kind of copyright law addressing, or could it fail to address similar issues in modern music with completely different compositional approaches and production approaches?
Well, I think this is a really critical point. All of these laws were sort of based on an older model of making music, where like George Gershwin would sit down at a piano and write the chords and, you know, write the melodies, and his brother Iowa would write the lyrics. Things haven't been done that way in decades. Even in the case of Let's Get It On, the story is that Ed Townsend wrote it on a piano and his sister was present when he did it. And that when he started the original lyrics, it was more about overcoming addiction. He was friends with Marvin Gaye. He worked with him. He played him the song. Marvin agreed to do it. And then they changed the lyrics and they went in the studio and made the recording. You can imagine that what Townsend wrote and what he composed with Marvin Gaye was pretty skeletal, but then the song as we know it was built out in the studio. One of the most famous parts of the song, Let's Get It On, is the opening guitar riff, the wah-wah, boom, 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 boom. And like, if you play those notes at a wedding, you know, everybody erupts in joy because they know that just as much as they know the lyrics or the chorus. I have a reissue of the album Let's Get It On, and I pulled it out, and there's like a bonus track of the demo of Let's Get It On. And a lot of what Marvin is singing, like he's not quite there yet, you know, like he's working on his melody, but that guitar part is, and it's almost exactly the way it ended up on the final. So for decades now, there's been a commingling of like composition and production. I think to any contemporary musician, that's the way they see it. Like the finished record is the thing. And there may be elements in it, like the lyrics, you know, that like can be written down. But I think just about any musician today would think it would be really weird to just boil that down into a reduction that's just a bunch of chords and a vocal melody, and that's it.
Has there been any major lawsuit that's tested this thing that we're talking about? Is the Katy Perry Dark Horse lawsuit in this ecosystem?
No.
Okay, so there's nothing that's tested it in terms of the truly contemporary songwriting and compositional approach.
Also because it's bifurcated. The law knows how to deal with one composition copying another composition. And the law knows how to deal with a piece of a sound recording that is used without permission. That's basically a sample. But the idea that the production of a track copies another song's production, I don't think there is anything in the law about how to deal with that.
The reason I'm asking is I sort of think, in so much as there is copyright crime or style ripoff in contemporary music, maybe it is a little bit more along the lines of the vibe situation that came up in the Blurred Lines trial. And the thing that sticks out to me really a lot from recent years, when Iggy Azalea put out Fancy, her like big breakthrough hit, that is widely acknowledged as a ripoff of DJ Mustard's production style. DJ Mustard had been making hits with YG and other West Coast rappers for a couple of years prior. And for what it's worth, Bay Area artists have said Mustard was ripping them off. But, you know, from a popularization perspective, Mustard had the signature sound. And then when Fancy came out, I remember people being like, oh, DJ Mustard produced this record. It was very obviously a Mustard song. And it was very much not a DJ Mustard record. Let's listen to Fancy and take another break.
Still stunned how you love that. Got the whole world asking how I does that. Hot girl, hands off, don't touch that. Look at it, I bet you wishing you could clutch that. That's just the way you like it, huh? It's so good, he just wishing he could bite it, huh? Never turn down nothing, slaying it. Go trigger on the trigger like
in the way you're describing, there's nothing in contemporary law that basically says Iggy Azalea and her producers cannot just absolutely rip off the style, approach, texture of a well-known producer's style and use it for them. Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I don't want people to go to court over all this stuff, but it's like, that seems to me the modern equivalent of whatever happens in these Sheeran cases. Like, people are not going to be stealing, especially now when like every record label has forensic musicologists to deal with sampling and interpolations and stuff. I don't feel people are trying to get away with things quite as much as they were 10 or 20 years ago. But I think you are seeing a lot of like commingling of styles and pulling on threads that other people have started. I think you're seeing a lot of that. That seems like way more worrisome and problematic than this thing that we're talking about.
It raises the question of, if the law doesn't address it, does it actually encourage that? And also, just, is there anything wrong with it? You know, like, is there anything wrong with copying somebody's production technique? I mean, that's like the story of pop music, is like Phil Spector's style was copied by the Beach Boys, and everybody copied, you know, Nile Rodgers' disco style, right? And like the 80s gated snare drum was a copied technique. So in terms of the law, no, there's no way for it to address it. That's like saying that Al Pacino could have a copyright on how he does Michael Corleone. The imitation of another artist's style, to my knowledge, is not addressed in the law, and I don't believe there's any cases about it. One of the interesting things about this Ed Sheeran case, I felt, is the arguments all came down to the chord and the groove. It was the 4 chords and the specific, what they would call the harmonic rhythm, meaning like the way it is syncopated. So the way you play 4 specific chords in a syncopated way. That was essentially the whole of the plaintiff's case, to say Ed Sheeran copied my dad, you know, the way he played that groove. Under the law, it's extremely thin, because that specific 4-chord pattern is extremely generic. It's been used in dozens of songs. The defense was able to demonstrate that very, very easily, that this goes back way longer than Let's Get It On. Even the rhythmic way it is played goes back deeper than Let's Get It On, which, you know, you find yourself in the courtroom thinking, well, geez, like, can anything be copyrighted? Are any 4 chords safe here? Do you need 25 chords for it to be quote unquote original and not generic? Listening to Ed Sheeran and Amy Wadge talk about how they created the song. So Amy is somebody that he met when he was very young. They recorded a lot of songs together. Ed works fast, and they worked really well together. And Amy, like, her company is called 4 Chords LLC or something. And her joke was like, I'm not a like sophisticated, you know, fancy composer. I use 4 chords and I write songs, and I concentrate on the lyrics and the melody. That's my style. They were hanging out at his house, catching up as friends. They were going to go to dinner with Ed's parents one evening. He goes to take a shower, and she's sitting down on his couch playing around with the chords.
Listening to Let's Get It On.
That's a key thing. She was fooling around with some chords and humming a melody. And like, when he gets out of the shower, he looks and says like, whoa, we got to do something with that. That's good. And so they write the song together. They record a demo, and then 2 days later, he goes into a studio and records it. It seemed unlikely to me that as a composition, them sitting there and composing it, that it probably sounded anything like Let's Get It On. But if you listen to those two songs, if you listen to the groove of Thinking Out Loud and you listen to the groove of Let's Get It On, they are very similar. There's people on YouTube who have cut it up so that one bar starts with Ed Sheeran and the other bar goes to Marvin Gaye and then comes back. They sound almost exactly the same, which suggests it's a production thing, that somehow, whether intentionally or not, the groove was lined up. And maybe it's just that it's a super, Let's Get It On is like a super famous, beloved song, and people have it in their minds as like a perfect, somewhat slow tempo groove to mimic, in the way that like maybe there are Beatles grooves that you might find yourself copying. But the more and more that they talked about the 4 chords and whether it is an F sharp minor or a D major, seemed to me like it was less getting to the point of was there copying than the way it was recorded. That's just my personal opinion.
You did a thing last week or the week before going through recent copyright case history. There's only one big case every few years, it seems. It does feel like, a tide is moving in one direction. The Blurred Lines verdict, it's moving against new artists taking inspiration. And then the Ed Sheeran case, it's moving towards new artists taking inspiration. Do you think that these cases actually represent tide shifts, or do they represent individual actors who successfully convince a jury? To me, I'm not sure it feels tidal in that exact way.
That's always the big question. I think as the media, we want to find a narrative. Each case individually does rise or fall on its merits and is sort of its own independent decision, especially when it's a matter of a jury. I do think, and I reported on this a lot after Blurred Lines, that Blurred Lines shook things tremendously, and it caused a lot of, it's the perception partly was the thing, is that did it actually change the law? No, it did not. It was just one case and it wasn't a precedent. But the perception was that the rules had shifted and that something that you didn't think that you used to be at risk for, now you were at risk for. There was an increase in the number of cases filed. That stuff has been tracked and it's been shown. There were also examples of things happening outside of court, like writers being cut in on songs where there was some kind of behind the scenes accusation that was settled.
Preemptively or prophylactically, dare I say.
And that kind of thing does indeed happen all the time. It's happened for many, many decades, well before Blurred Lines, that there were cases where somebody releases a song and then somebody comes out and says, that sounds a little bit like mine, and some kind of, friendly deal is cut. So some of it is tidal to an extent. Some of it, I think, is rooted simply in those individual cases. I do think that the Led Zeppelin verdicts is important because that had an appeals court ruling that specifically addressed some of these questions of how do you deal with a case when you're dealing with these sort of commonplace generic elements. What's the threshold to say that something copied another when it's as simple as basic chords, basic scales and stuff? And so that was an important ruling. And even though that was in California in the Ninth Circuit, the judge in this case in New York, he had paused the Ed Sheeran trial to see how that turned out. There are certain aspects of this that build upon each other, and there's a certain sort of narrative to the law and how it is applied. And some of it is just the perception in the industry and the idea of who has the advantage here? Do plaintiffs have the advantage or not? Because if plaintiffs have an advantage, then if you're a defendant, if you're a famous, popular singer, you may want to settle early to just get it out of the hands of a jury.
When we're talking about common elements, there are certain subgenres or segments of music or whatever where entire scenes are built upon essentially common elements. And there is just an insane amount of overlap between artists, songs, production approaches. And so it's always seemed like patently poor faith to me when these cases are brought. Like, obviously people steal, I get that. But in general, is there not some kind of implicit handshake amongst musicians and creators that, hey, we're all drawing from the same pool? Do the cases that have been brought, the Blurred Lines case, the Thinking Out Loud case, are they not, in essence, violations of an implied handshake agreement amongst all creators?
How many handshake agreements between all musicians do you think there really are? That we're all going to be so honorable, nobody's going to sue somebody else. Think about Taylor Swift getting a cut of the Olivia Rodrigo song. I mean, that's one that was surprising to see, like, really? Like, why couldn't they let that one go? I think at a certain level, it's just about money. And I also think that, like in this case, for example, it wasn't one working musician against another. It was the estate of a deceased songwriter going after a famous artist. And that's a very common thing. I mean, that's what happened in Blurred Lines. The Katy Perry case was a Christian rapper whose song was like a moderate hit in the world of Christian rap, but obviously was not at the level of a Katy Perry hit. I don't think that there's some honor code that says, since we're musicians, we're not going to sue each other. I think that the more famous the defendant is, the more incentive there is, the more motivation to sue them, thinking maybe they will just settle.
Ed Sheeran, I think, brought this up in his testimony. If he loses the case, he said, maybe I'll retire. And I've got to imagine it's fatiguing to be a successful musician and just constantly be a target, to know that other people view you as a potential payday for no work, basically.
Yeah, but it's also interesting to think that not everybody gets sued. Not everybody gets accused of this. And this is something that has happened to Ed Sheeran repeatedly. It didn't come up in trial because I think it was specifically excluded. Like in any case, it's only about the facts of that specific thing. And so there was no discussion of all the other times that he's been accused of plagiarism and the result of those other accusations and lawsuits. Ed Sheeran comes across as kind of a sponge. He does these mashups. He likes taking bits and pieces of other songs and putting them together. He likes writing songs in pretty simple, repetitive formats of just looping the same 4 chords and not having much more complication to his compositions. So I don't know. I mean, I think like in another context, we might view that as eclectic, that Ed Sheeran is somebody who likes taking bits and pieces of things, and he is interested in a lot of different kinds of music. And so he mingles it all together. And like, that's part of his strength, is that he pulls from disparate sources and he has his own voice. But you could see that that also makes him a target. Any number of dozens of people could say, hey, he stole some of my hoof.
Yes, sure. And also, just to be very plain, Ed Sheeran is also making, by and large, very, very, very centrist pop music. He is making successful pop music, but it is very centrist stylistically. And so I think if people think there's no Ed Sheeran style inherent to Ed Sheeran, that's actually what makes him as much of a victim. Not simply that he's flexible and versatile and takes in a lot of input, but also that the output is sort of studiously neutral. And I think other artists who have been sued can make a case that they themselves, the bulk of their creative output, the overwhelming tone of their oeuvre is signature. And there is something studiously neutral and centrist about the bulk of Ed Sheeran's output that maybe leaves him a little bit more vulnerable in these cases.
I think that's true. I think that's fair. And that's part of what I was getting at. I don't think it's fair to say that he has no voice, no style. I mean,
I also like Ed Sheeran, just for the record. Like, it's like, this is not a shot at Ed Sheeran. Like, I quite like Ed Sheeran's music. I've interviewed Ed Sheeran. I think Ed Sheeran's very good. Like, it's not about that. It's more about the overall affect of the thing.
But don't you think that he, as a person, the thing that connects all that is that like there is an Ed Sheeran that's at the center of all those songs. And it's his voice, his literal voice, but it's also like his own approach, his own sort of spirit that comes across. I mean, that's just my personal opinion, but like, I don't think it's fair to just smear him as like, he's just an algorithm combining this stuff.
I don't think that it's just an algorithm, but I think actually Ed Sheeran is such an adept absorber of styles, and he's such a refined pop ear that I think his absorptions get so thoroughly digested that what ends up on the back end is something that's so smooth that you almost can't lay a finger on it. It's so like laser target. I mean, this is the one thing I do remember from interviewing Ed is, you know, he's very interested in numbers and chart positions and streaming numbers and so on and so forth. Like, he wants to make hits. He wants to get right to the top. He is laser focused on that kind of Big Ten success. And I think he's an adept enough writer and performer to find ways of absorbing influence, but also sandpapering down anything in a song that would distract from its warhead-like path to the top of the chart. I don't think that's saying he has no style. I think that's saying that his style or his approach is somehow so sophisticated that it appears to be without style, but in fact it is quite complicated and nuanced.
He's not quite as adept at sanding down some of these similarities to other songs, though. It could be debated about how meritorious these various accusations are, but he's settled cases. He's added writers to songs in order to deal with that. He has a little bit of a problem. This is something that has come up numerous times. Yes, it is possible that it has happened just because he's famous and so he's a target. It's also possible that it's happened because, like you said, he's a sort of absorber of many influences, and he's a guy who likes to work fast and not second guess himself. And so sometimes he puts things out and like maybe there is a little too much of the influence. Like on Shape of You, there was the TLC issue where he testified about this in court, where in an early version of that song, there actually was like a reference in the lyrics to TLC. And then they took it out and the song comes out and like immediately people are saying, you know what, that melody kind of sounds like No Scrubs. And so very quickly they added the songwriters of No Scrubs to it. There was no lawsuit involved. But I think in that case, it was so obvious that it was undeniable. The case was only about one song, and it was about the composition and the chords written down on a piece of paper. So the law has a way of whittling these things down to a very narrow question, which is exactly what it should be doing. But if you look at the big picture of Ed Sheeran, I think it's understandable why this might happen to him.
Are we seeing at all in your mind, given this outcome, a tide shift away from prophylactically crediting songwriters of other songs, away from songwriters living in fear that they are going to be dragged into court or litigated, lawyered to death behind the scenes in order to give up 20% of the publishing on such and such a record? Are people breathing a little easier now?
I don't think it's a trend. I think we're going to see lots more lawsuits in the future. Some of them will have merit and some of them won't. I think there will be lots of times that a song comes out and somebody blogs about it and says, that kind of sounds like that other Motown song. And then we'll see it credits quickly adjusted. I think it's possible that it might cause more second thoughts among some people to file cases. You know, there's one case that's alive right now. This was filed, well before this trial, but it's about the dembow rhythm in reggaeton.
I'm really fascinated by that case.
Right. And so like, that's the question of like, can you steal a rhythm, like a beat? That's something that copyright law is not super clear about. I don't think there's a great history of precedents about it. On its face, it seems fishy. It seems like this probably is not going to succeed, but you never know.
I mean, and just for clarity, the dembow rhythm is essentially the backbone of all of reggaeton.
Yes.
Like, so it's not simply like, hey, this one song in 2021 borrowed a drum pattern from this other song from 1990, whatever. It's literally like, if that case succeeds, everyone's on the hook.
And I'm sure that the defense lawyers will hire a lot of really good musicologists to comb through lots of old songs and find that same rhythm in a 1950s doo-wop song and a 1920s jazz track. And maybe Beethoven even has it in one of his symphonies. Like, they're going to go down to the mat to say that that beat did not originate with, what is it, like Fish Market or whatever is the name of the song. But it's like, there's a specific song that is the complaining track. The way to beat that is to say, no, it didn't originate with you. You didn't create it. It's a common building block. So they got to go and find proof that it is a common building block. And I'm sure that there are people making $500 an hour researching that as we speak.
Well, we do support people who are patrons of the arts and academics, and we appreciate that, broadly speaking. I wish those people a lot of success. I think that's a good place to leave off. I do want to keep an eye on that trial. I'm sure when that thing, if it goes to trial, I'm sure we'll be back to talk about it. That's our show. Thanks to Ben. Listen to every podcast ever at nytimes.com/podcast. Get the t-shirt and the stickers. It's the podcast.myshopify.com. Subscribe anywhere you get your audio content, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc., etc. Also YouTube. We are on YouTube now. So if that's a thing that you do for podcasts, YouTube, go watch the logo and listen to us. Email us. We're going to do a mailbag soon. I'll give more information on the Facebook group and in the Discord, but email us, podcast@nytimes.com. Get in the Discord and the Facebook group, tinyurl.com/podcast Discord or /podcast Facebook. Our producer, as always, is Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. We will be back next week. Let's go out with my unfairly targeted queen, Olivia Rodrigo. Free her. This is Deja Vu.